From his home page, Max types the employee's name in the search bar and selects it from below. From the employee's profile page, Max clicks the Pay tab on the left-hand side of the screen to view the current funding for Patty under the Costing Allocations tab. We can see that Patty has an active costing allocation as of today. Here we can see three things: that the costing has been in place since September 1st, 2019. The type of costing is worker costing or worker plus position, and the costing is 100% allocated from educational studies. View All Costing Allocations button allows you to view historical dated costing for a particular worker. Because we received a grant for June, Max will make an update to split fund Patty using a costing allocation. There are a couple of options available for Max. He can either click the Maintain button or type Assign Costing Allocation in the search bar to start. Let's use the search bar to navigate to the Assign Costing Allocation page. Once on the Assign Costing Allocation page, notice the Help Available blurb appears in the top right-hand side of the screen. You may click Show Me to display field-level help text if necessary, which, once selected, is denoted by question mark icons next to each field. Remember from earlier in the course that worker costing is the most common way to assign costing override for temporary or grant funding. Here, Max enters Patty's name, and notice how Workday auto-populates her position. If multiple positions exist for an employee, ensure the correct one is selected using the menu button in the field. If Max wanted to update costing for a future dated position change, he would need to click the menu button next to the position, select Future Positions, and then select a position as applicable. Let's do a quick review of the Earnings field and the Position Restriction section. Earnings will be left blank since this overnight is not being applied to a specific earning type, such as overtime or an allowance. If this is selected for future use, the next screen will only edit funding for that specific earning and will not affect the sources associated with an employee's regular pay or any other earnings type. Position restrictions put the costing allocation on the position itself, regardless of who occupies it. Funding is permanent and stays with the position even if the position is vacated. This is typically done for positions on a position management staffing model. We will click OK to continue to the next page. On this page, Max knows he's doing a worker costing because the employee's name and position are displayed at the top. We can see the existing costing allocation listed for Patty. If this section is blank, it means that a costing allocation of this type has never been entered for an employee. The start date reflects the date that funds will or have been allocated to the worker or position. End date is the date when you want the funding to stop expensing. It is also what drives when an encumbrance will end. Recall that the default organizational assignment work tags are assigned to the employee's position, identify the department that owns the position, and where it is housed. In this case, Max can see the position is owned by Educational Studies Administration. These work tags also act as a default safety net to provide funding when no other costing allocation exists in case of missing or expired funding. We do not want to use these work tags to expense any salary or benefits for the employee, so we're updating the costing allocation. We can see that Patty was funded 100% through the Educational Studies Administration. Next, Max will split fund the employee between the current funding and the new source by using the Copy Costing Allocation box. This allows Max to use the existing funding line as a basis for the next funding block, copies the existing costing allocation into a new section above the existing one, and defaults today's date as a start date, which can be edited. Notice there is an error and an alert that has populated. Purpose of this is to be able to guide you to the information that Workday needs you to complete. Looks like Max forgot to enter an end date for the previous costing block that was effective September 1st, so he received an error noting the start date cannot overlap the end date for that costing allocation. Since payroll for May has ended, Max enters the effective end date of May 31st for the existing funding. In the new costing allocation block, he enters the start date of June 1st for when the new funding is going to start. Since accurate dates have been entered, the error is resolved. He leaves the end date field blank, so Workday knows to continue using the funding sources in this section going forward. This funding will continue to charge and encumber until the end of the fiscal year and through the life of the grant, which is no greater than 5 years for anything using a grant. If you do not want to encumber for the life of the grant, then you will need to enter an end date on the costing allocation. We will leave this blank. Let's add a row to continue split funding the employee's record. Notice the default organizational assignment work tags populate under the default column and are the ones listed under the default organizational assignment section as well. Best practice is to move from left to right when entering costing allocations and notice how each default work tag disappears when a new one is added, and vice versa. If one is removed, Workday will auto-assign the default work tags. Let's see this in action. Max selects the Ohio State University as the costing company, and in doing so, the default work tag disappears. If he removes the work tag, the default, which in this case is the same, appears back under the default column. We will add this back in. Next, since Max knows the cost center number, he goes ahead and enters that in. Note that you can also type in the cost center name itself and then select the appropriate one from the drop-down. Notice that once the cost center was entered, the related balancing unit and function work tags defaulted in. Since Max is directly charging the grant, he will want to use the FD520 work tag in the fund column. Note that if you are cost sharing, then the fund will need to be updated after the grant work tag has been added. Next, since Max knows the grant value to add, he will do so now. Always enter the grant last, since the related fund and/or function may update based on the value used. Scroll over to the right, and Max will now split fund using the distribution percent column and enter 50% for both lines to ensure the sum of the lines equals 100%. If the grant you are using is subject to a salary cap, you will see an action icon in the Salary over the Cap column to access the Salary over the Cap sub-allocation costing grid for grants that are subject to a cap. That will allow you to add different funding source for the overage portion of the salary. Once the salary cap has been met, the overage will go to this funding source to avoid overcharging grants. Remember from before, the 5 main work tags that must be used for costing allocations at a minimum are balancing unit, company, cost center, function, and fund. Max double-checks the 5 critical work tags prior to submitting the request. Max scrolls down and can see the previous funding that was copied. He is able to enter any comments as needed before submitting the request for approval. Next, he clicks Submit. The next screen shows that the transaction has been successfully submitted. Max expands the details and processes to view the request and sees the new split in funding, including the start date of the new costing. Since a grant was used and no end date was selected, salary will be charged to the grant through the grant's end date, and payroll will encumber through the life of the grant, up to 5 years. Max can also see the distribution percentage that it was set to. Below, he can view the old funding information that was updated as well. Under the Process tab, he can see the business process history. He can see that the initiation step was submitted on May 13th. Some approvals were bypassed due to the respective work tags not being used. He can also see the approvers for each of the cost center work tags used. Max can now monitor the status of the worker costing by navigating to the worker profile, From there, he will go to Job, then the Worker History tab to view the status of the request. This shows all costing that has been submitted or initiated. Here, we can see that the request is in progress. Authorized users can cancel in-progress requests from my employee's profile page. Security roles for these users are Payroll Costing Specialist, Manager, Manager Liaison, and Manager's Manager. The request can be canceled on the Worker History screen. From here, hover over the Costing Allocation under the Business Process column, and click the Related Actions button. Hover over Business Process, and then click Cancel. On the next screen, review the request, scroll down, enter any comments identifying the reason for the cancellation, and then click Submit. A new costing allocation would then need to be submitted for the specific employee. For purposes of this demo, we will not cancel this request. This concludes the assigned costing allocation demonstration.